Imagine a cold morning in Edinburgh, 1860. The air carries the faint metallic scent of rain and soot, and a line of students moves down the corridor toward the surgical theater. Their footsteps echo like a slow heartbeat against the stone. At the front walks a young surgeon with pale eyes and a quiet voice. His name is Joseph Lister, and he is already thinking about the day's operations, not with excitement, but with the careful dread of someone who has seen too many wounds that do not heal. The theater itself is a bowl of light and shadow. Rows of students rise above a wooden table stained with years of practice. The instruments gleam faintly in their tray: scalpels, saws, forceps, none of them truly clean. In those days, cleanliness was not yet considered part of science. Blood dried on smocks was a badge of experience. A surgeon's coat was never washed. The older and darker it was, the more respect it commanded. Lister looks around this room and feels something most others do not. Unease. The smell alone tells a story. It clings to the walls, sweet, metallic, and faintly sour, the smell of infection. He knows that half of the patients who enter this room will never walk out alive. They will die slowly, not from their wounds, but from what comes after, the invisible rot that no one yet understands. He begins the operation with his usual calm precision, each movement deliberate, measured, almost graceful. He speaks little. The students lean forward, fascinated by the elegance of his hands. When it's over, he steps back, removes his gloves, and looks at the man on the table. He knows the odds. The patient may survive the pain, but not the days that follow. Lister has seen too many fevers, too many wounds turn black, too many men sink into delirium while the doctors argue about air and bad luck. That evening, walking home beneath the gas lamps, he passes the infirmary's rear courtyard. It's where they burn the soiled dressings, the old linens, the scraps of flesh too diseased to bury. The fire glows faintly through the fog, and the smoke curls upward, carrying with it the scent of everything he cannot yet explain. He stops for a moment, watching it rise, and feels the weight of ignorance pressing down. Lister was not a loud man, nor a proud one. He was the kind who spoke softly even when the room demanded noise. His colleagues admired his skill, but found his obsession with cleanliness unnecessary, almost superstitious. Yet he kept noticing the same pattern. When wounds were washed with carbolic acid, the pungent, burning disinfectant used to treat sewage. Patients lived. When they were not, they died. It seemed too simple, almost absurd, but the numbers refused to lie. In his notebooks, written in precise, slanted handwriting, Lister began to record every detail: the temperature of the room, the exact dilution of the acid, the kind of bandages used. He counted recoveries, not as victories, but as proof, fragile, imperfect proof, that something invisible was at work. At night, his small study filled with the smell of chemicals. Bottles cluttered the desk, each labeled in his tidy script. He spent hours watching drops of solutions slide down glass slides, the lamplight trembling over his hands. The world beyond the window carried on. Carriage wheels, laughter from the taverns, the faint chime of a clock tower. Inside, Lipson remained bent over his experiments, his face lit by a single flame. Sometimes, even his own students doubted him. They joked quietly that their teacher was becoming more chemist than surgeon. But there was something different in Lister's patience, not the vanity of discovery, but the humility of someone listening for an answer that others couldn't yet hear. In those days, surgery was a kind of organized chaos. Patients screamed through operations or slipped under the new anesthetics that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. The surgeons moved quickly, competing in speed more than precision. Each cut was a race against blood loss. Infection was accepted as fate. They called it hospital gangrene or ward fever, as though the building itself exhaled disease. Lister began to wonder if it did. if the air itself carried death. One evening, he visited a friend at the new Glasgow sewage works, where engineers used carbolic acid to mask the stench of waste. The smell was sharp and biting, but Libser noticed something strange. The refuse heaps treated with the acid didn't breed flies. The idea stayed with him. If it could stop decay there, perhaps it could stop decay in wounds. He began to test it quietly, without announcement. Soaking dressings, cleaning instruments, washing his hands before touching a patient, a habit that drew curious stares. The results were startling. Men who should have died began to heal. The black rot of gangrene retreated. Fever subsided. Word spread slowly, as all good sense does. Some called it luck, others coincidence, but a few listened. Across the channel, Louis Pasteur was proving that microorganisms caused fermentation, life itself, born of the invisible. When Lister read Pasteur's work, he felt something click into place. The invisible enemy he'd been fighting had a name at last: germs. In his lectures, he began to speak of them in calm, measured tones, as though describing a faint melody that only he could hear. He didn't thunder or command. He reasoned. When we dress a wound, he said, we must remember that it is not the air itself which causes decomposition, but the organisms which the air carries. To the older surgeons, it sounded like nonsense. Invisible killers? Too small to see? They laughed behind closed doors and in public journals. Some even accused him of witchcraft by another name, superstition dressed in science. But Lister continued, undeterred. His faith was quiet but immovable, the kind that endures mockery because truth, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. He kept experimenting, refining, teaching. His students became his apostles, carrying the message to hospitals across Britain and beyond. Some of them failed, misusing the acid, scalding skin, or applying it too late. But slowly, the tide began to turn. Mortality rates fell, hospitals grew quieter. The smell of death lessened. Still, for all his discoveries, Lipsync never seemed to bask in victory. He carried himself with the same gentle solemnity he'd always had, as though aware that every saved life was balanced by those he hadn't reached in time. There's a small detail many forget. Lister often suffered from insomnia. He would rise at night, walk the halls of his home, and check the windows though no one was awake to see. Perhaps it was habit from the wards, or perhaps he could never quite rid himself of the sound of patients murmuring in fevered sleep. His wife Agnes sometimes found him sitting at his desk long after midnight, staring at a glass slide as if it were a window into another world. She never interrupted him. She understood that silence was his truest companion. In time, the same surgeons who mocked him began to follow his methods. Carbolic spray became standard in operating rooms. Instruments gleamed under clean hands. The mortality rate of amputations, once nearly 50%, fell to single digits. And yet, in true Victorian fashion, gratitude came slowly, almost grudgingly. Lister accepted it all with quiet grace. When Queen Victoria herself recovered from surgery thanks to his antiseptic method, the Empire finally took notice. He was knighted, though he continued to work as if nothing had changed. Titles meant little to a man who'd spent his life watching breath flicker between existence and absence. He never became wealthy, not in the way his peers did. His reward was subtler, a cleaner air in the wards, a generation of doctors who no longer carried death under their fingernails. In his old age, he walked more slowly, his hands trembling slightly, but his mind remained sharp. Once, when asked what drove him, he said only, "I seek not fame, but truth." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of every night he'd spent alone in those dim rooms, listening to the soft whisper of survival. And when he finally passed, the newspapers spoke of revolution, the man who taught the world to wash its hands. But if you could have seen him in life, you would know it wasn't revolution that guided him. It was compassion, a quiet refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable. Even now, hospitals hum with the ghost of his patients, the slow rhythm of precision and care, the scent of antiseptic in the air like a hymn to all he endured. The rhythm of their lives still echoes with his long after the instruments were cleaned and the lamps went out. He was older now, and quieter still. His beard had gone white, and his eyes, though gentle, carried the distance of someone who had seen far too many beginnings and endings. The world around him had changed in ways he could scarcely have imagined when he first walked the cobbled lanes of Edinburgh. Trains ran faster, hospitals grew larger, and the streets of London were no longer thick with horse dung, but with the scent of coal and progress. Yet in the operating rooms, the same question remained: how to keep death from finding its way in. Lister had begun to think of death not as an enemy, but as a shadow that followed too closely. He never pretended he could banish it, only delay its arrival. And that humility, perhaps, was what made him so unlike the other men who filled lecture halls and polished journals with their own names. He still taught occasionally, though his voice had grown softer with age, forcing the students to lean forward to hear gentleness. He would say, is as necessary as skill. They wrote that down as if it were an equation, but few truly understood. He meant it literally. A trembling hand, a snapped suture, a moment's carelessness, those could mean the difference between life and death. Precision was mercy. By now, the idea of antisepsis had spread across Europe and into America. Carbolic acid had given way to new methods: steam sterilization, alcohol scrubs, cleaner air. The tools of medicine gleamed beneath gaslights, and the smell of decay had nearly vanished from the wards. It was a quieter kind of revolution. No banners, no speeches, only the steady sound of washing hands and boiling instruments. Sometimes, Lister would visit these new hospitals, walking slowly through their corridors like a man returning to an old dream. He would pause outside the operating theaters and listen, not to the surgeons, but to the silence that followed. No screams now, no chaos, just the measured rhythm of breath under anesthesia and the faint clink of metal on metal. It must have felt like a kind of peace. But even peace has its ghosts. Lister still remembered the faces of those he'd lost before he found his method. The young soldier, the seamstress, the child with the broken leg. They lingered at the edges of his thoughts like voices through fog. He spoke of them rarely, though once, to a colleague, he confessed that every antiseptic bottle felt like an apology. "If I had known sooner," he murmured, "how many might have lived." His wife's health began to fail around this time. Agnes had always been his companion in the truest sense, his assistant, his translator, his patient witness through the long nights of study. When she fell ill, he nursed her himself, following every rule he had ever taught. He kept her room spotless, her linens fresh, the air faintly scented with carbolic. But there are limits to every science. She passed quietly one spring morning while he was reading by her bedside. He closed the book and held her hand until the light changed. Afterward, those who visited him noticed that his house had grown even more silent. He moved through it like a man living among echoes. His study was still neat, the bottles still labeled, but dust began to gather in the corners. The laboratory smells were fainter now, the notes fewer. He still received letters from across the world, doctors thanking him, hospitals bearing his name, but he rarely answered. Progress no longer interested him. He had already made peace with his portion of it. Yet sometimes, when evening fell, he would light a single lamp and return to his desk. Not to experiment, but to remember. He'd trace a finger along his old notebooks, the pages stained and smudged, the handwriting small but steady. He'd read his own careful observations, infection absent, recovery complete, and feel the quiet satisfaction of someone who had, at last, kept his promise to the living. He thought often about the younger surgeons, those who had inherited the cleaner, safer world he'd helped create. They no longer feared the invisible, because they had names for it now. They no longer washed their hands in acid, but in warm water and soap. It must have felt so ordinary to them, the sound of washing before a procedure, that they never realized how much blood it had taken to make it ordinary. That, Lister thought, was the true measure of progress, when a miracle becomes a habit. He spent his final years near the coast, in a small house overlooking the gray-green sweep of the Channel. The air there was clean and salt-sharp, the sort of air he'd spent his life trying to give his patients. He took long walks with a cane, the gulls wheeling overhead, the wind snapping at his coat. The sea, with its steady rhythm, seemed to understand him. It was vast, constant, and beyond control, and yet it cleansed what it touched. Visitors said he looked peaceful in those years, though still haunted by thought. Once, a student asked him whether he believed his work would be remembered. He smiled faintly. "I hope the work is forgotten," he said, "and only the cleanliness remains." On the night of his death, he sat by the window long after the lamps had been put out. The tide was going out, and the moonlight glimmered on the water. A nurse found him still sitting there at dawn, his glasses folded neatly beside his chair, his face turned toward the sea. It was as if he'd simply followed the rhythm of the tide and let it carry him away. When news of his passing spread, doctors across the world paused before their first operations of the day. Some bowed their heads, others simply washed their hands in silence. It was not grief so much as gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that their own clean instruments, their own safe wards, were built on the labor of one man who had refused to accept the smell of death as normal. And though his name would fade with time, his influence would not. Each time a doctor lifts a scalpel under sterile light, each time a wound heals without fever, the echo of Joseph Lister moves quietly through the room, unseen, like the germs he once fought, but benevolent now, protective. He is still there, in the rhythm of clean hands and steady breath, in the whisper of cloth against metal, in the calm confidence that healing can be guided by care instead of luck. The rhythm of his life continues in the rhythm of theirs. And somewhere far beyond the years, the sea still moves in its endless tide, washing, cleansing, reminding, as if honoring the man who taught the world that purity, like mercy, begins in the smallest acts. He never sought monuments. Yet they appeared all the same, hospitals bearing his name, plaques on old stone walls, portraits hung in halls that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Lister would have found them uncomfortable, even unnecessary. To him, the real tribute was invisible, the absence of infection, the silence where once there had been suffering. In those final years, he was invited to lectures, celebrations, dinners in his honor. He accepted few. When he did attend, he sat quietly, a small, aging man in black, his hands folded neatly in his lap, while others spoke of his genius. The speeches embarrassed him. Words like revolutionary and savior seemed out of place to a man who still saw himself as an apprentice to nature. When he finally stood to speak, his voice was calm and brief. "If anything I have done endures," he said once, "it is because truth itself endures." What he meant, though few caught it, was that truth never truly belongs to one person. It passes from hand to hand, reshaped by each generation's understanding. He was merely one link in a long chain of healers stretching back to the first man who noticed that a wound washed in clean water fared better than one left to the flies. He sometimes reread letters from surgeons who had once mocked him. Many wrote to apologize, to thank him, to admit that his insistence on cleanliness had saved lives they never thought could be saved. He responded politely, though his answers were always brief. A few lines of gratitude, then a return to silence. The praise, he said, should belong to the patients who endured the experiments with faith and pain. Lister's world had been one of contradictions. The clamor of industrial progress beside the quiet persistence of disease, the gleam of scientific discovery in a century still haunted by superstition. He had walked between those worlds, bridging them not with grandeur, but with patience. That patience, steady, unsentimental, and deeply humane, was his true invention. Occasionally, younger doctors visited him by the sea, drawn by reverence and curiosity. They came expecting wisdom and found instead a man who spoke gently of small things. The way salt air clears the lungs, the importance of good light for reading, the discipline of rest. Once, one of them asked whether he still believed in the old rituals, the washing, the boiling, the endless precautions. Lister smiled faintly. Rituals, he said, are what people call habits that save lives. He told them stories from the early days, the laughter of colleagues, the skepticism, the smell of carbolic so strong it burned the eyes. They listened, half in awe, half disbelief, unable to imagine a world so filthy that a doctor's greatest weapon was soap. To them, antisepsis was not an idea but a given. They had never known otherwise. He seemed to find that both satisfying and slightly sad. When he walked them to the gate afterward, he always offered the same parting words: "Be kind to your patients. They lend you their bodies so that you may learn." The students would nod, promise they would, and head back to the cities where the future waited, brighter and cleaner than the one he had known. There were days, though, when the quiet weighed on him. He would sit by the window watching the gulls trace circles in the air and think of the operating theaters of his youth, the gaslight glare, the rush of footsteps, the low murmur of students taking notes. He missed the rhythm of it, the hum of focus that made time dissolve. But he knew he had earned the stillness. It was the rarest kind of peace, one built not on ignorance, but on understanding. He began to write again, though not for publication. His notebooks became more like reflections than experiments, pages filled with neat observations of clouds, birds, the smell of the sea after rain. "The air here," he wrote once, "is clean. I sometimes forget to be grateful for that." On his 75th birthday, a letter arrived from a hospital in India, thanking him for the lives saved through his teachings. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer beside a pressed sprig of lavender from his wife's garden. Later that evening, as he watched the sun sink into the horizon, he whispered to no one in particular, "So it spreads." It was not pride, but quiet relief, the feeling of a duty fulfilled. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought of his father, who had been a scientist too, polishing lenses to make the invisible visible. It felt fitting, somehow, that his own life had followed the same arc, seeking clarity in what could not be seen. He imagined his father's hands, steady and exact, shaping glass to catch the light. He imagined his own, washed and ready, shaping a world to better hold life. When he finally drifted toward sleep, the sound of the sea came through the window. Soft, rhythmic, unending. It reminded him of the pulse beneath a patient's wrist, the fragile proof that life persists. He smiled faintly in the dark, the corners of his eyes creasing. If you had stood outside his window that night, you might have seen the lamplight dim, then fade entirely, leaving only the moonlight glimmering across the water. Inside, the air was still, the desk neatly ordered, the instruments clean and gleaming in their box. On the wall hung a small painting of a hospital ward, white sheets, bright windows, and a sense of calm that no one in his youth would have believed possible. He left behind no heirs, no children to carry his name, only his method, which was enough. The generations that followed would forget the smell of carbolic and the sting of antiseptic spray, but they would remember the ritual he had taught them. The washing, the care, the respect for what is unseen. And so, even as medicine moved into the modern age, the rhythm of Lister's work continued quietly beneath it all, like a steady heartbeat under layers of sound. The rhythm of precision, of gentleness, of faith in reason over noise, a rhythm that would outlast him. It still lingers, faint but unmistakable, in every ward, every scrub room, every careful preparation before a surgeon takes a breath and begins. And if you listen closely, in the hush before the first incision, in the silence of sterilized air, you can almost hear it, the echo of clean hands, the whisper of mercy made ordinary. Hello there. Tonight, we're walking through the narrow streets of Victorian London where the air itself could make you sick. Your boots stick to the cobblestones, black with soot and something worse. The fog tastes of coal and ash. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls. Another life gone, another house waiting. You pull your coat tighter, the lantern flickering in your hand, and keep moving toward the next patient. Inside, the room is small, and the air is still. A child wheezes in the corner. A mother watches you with hope that feels heavier than the sickness itself. You wash your hands in a bowl of cold water that's already gray, and you tell yourself it's enough. Out there, the newspapers call you a hero. In here, you can barely breathe. Now, dim the lights. Let's see what it truly meant to heal in the age of filth and fog. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a narrow London room that smells faintly of coal dust and boiled linens. The window panes are fogged from your own breath, and beyond them, the street lamps glow through mist like coins dropped into milk. Somewhere outside, a carriage wheel hits a rut and splashes filthy water against the curb. The city is already awake in its own sluggish way. Carts creaking, boots clattering, chimney smoke thickening into the air. You sit up slowly, the bedsheets cool and rough against your skin, and remember that you're a doctor, which in the late Victorian age means you're already late. There's no coffee waiting for you, no warm water for washing, just a chipped basin and the faint hum of the street below. You dress by habit, shirt, waistcoat, coat, scarf, gloves, all smelling faintly of disinfectant and pipe smoke. The air in your small surgery will be no warmer than the street, but you've long since stopped noticing the cold. What you do notice are the small things. The sound of the bell above the door when someone arrives too early, the way your boots squeak against the wet stone floor, the constant tug of fatigue behind your eyes. You once imagined medicine as a noble calling. These days it feels more like an endurance test. Outside, the fog tastes of soot. You can barely see 10 paces ahead, though you know the route by heart past the butcher, where pale cuts of meat hang behind glass, past the apothecary, its window crowded with green bottles and Latin labels, past the alley where the smell of rot never quite leaves, no matter how many times the city men flush it with carbolic acid. Every sound is softened by the mist, except the coughs, those always cut through, deep and hollow, echoing from doorways and narrow courts. Coughs are the background music of Victorian London. You make your first visit before sunrise. The patient is a child, feverish and pale, lying on a straw mattress that sags toward the floor. The mother hovers beside you, wringing her hands, whispering apologies for the room's state. You tell her it's all right, you've seen worse, and it's true. The air is damp and heavy with the smell of wet wool and sickness, but at least there's light from a single candle. You take the child's pulse, glance at the eyes, the tongue, the thin chest rising and falling too fast. You prescribe what little you can, rest, broth, a few drops of laudanum, if the pain grows too much. You know it may not help, but it gives the mother something to hold on to, and that's often the best medicine you can offer. In this world, medicine is half ritual, half guesswork. You were trained to believe in humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Though even now, the new science whispers that invisible things cause disease. But those invisible things don't yet have names that comfort your patients. They believe in drafts, in bad air, in curses, and sometimes in God's punishment. You've learned to nod at all of it. The truth, if it exists, lies somewhere between your stethoscope and the prayer book on the shelf. As you walk to your next appointment, the street grows busier. Newspaper boys shout headlines about Parliament and plague, though most people can't afford to care about either. The market stalls spill over with bruised fruit and tired fish. Somewhere nearby, a horse collapses, its breath turning to steam in the cold air before it stills. You look once, briefly, and keep walking. You've seen enough stillness for one lifetime. The rhythm of your days rarely changes. Morning visits to the poor, afternoon consultations for the modestly middle class, evening emergencies that stretch long into the night. Sometimes you earn your pay, often you do not. Some patients press coins into your hand as if ashamed of their poverty. Others offer small favors: a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a promise to pray for your soul. You take them all, not out of greed, but because refusal would embarrass them. And perhaps quietly, you've come to believe that goodwill has its own kind of currency. When you return to your surgery at midday, the smell hits you first: disinfectant, stale air, and the faint metallic tang of instruments left to soak in cloudy water. You light the lamp, check your appointment book, and hope no one comes with a wound too deep or a cough too wet. Your tools are clean but simple: scalpels, clamps, glass syringes, and the new ether inhaler that makes people dream before they bleed. The newspapers call it progress. You just call it quieter work. You might be interrupted by a knock at the door, a messenger boy, cap askew, holding a note from a desperate household. There's always a desperate household. You slip your notebook into your pocket and head back into the fog, feet finding their way through the familiar labyrinth of cobblestones. It's strange how the city feels alive, almost breathing. The river exhales its stink, the chimneys sigh, and every doorway hides a story you're not sure you want to hear. Sometimes, to steady yourself, you remember the things they told you at the hospital: that the body is a machine of exquisite balance, that nature wants to heal itself, that if you can just reduce the fever, restore the appetite, and keep the heart steady, the rest will follow. But that was in the bright lecture rooms of your training days, not in the dark reality of East London. Here, balance feels like an illusion. The poor work until they collapse. The rich pretend not to see, and you move between them like a ghost in a topcoat. On rare afternoons, you have patients who are almost cheerful: a clerk with exhaustion from too many ledgers, a laundress with cracked hands, a baker who's burned his arm on the oven again. You patch them up, listen to their small complaints, and sometimes share a laugh. It's strange how humor survives everywhere, even in places where hope seems in short supply. You've learned that laughter is the body's quietest medicine, though you'd never write that in a medical journal. Beyond the city, in the growing suburbs, a different kind of doctoring takes place. Country air, cleaner water, fewer corpses in the gutters. You think about it sometimes, what it would be like to trade your cramped surgery for a cottage and a garden. But the city keeps you, not by affection, but by habit. Every street corner is a reminder that you're needed, even if not wanted. The rhythm of your life has become inseparable from the rhythm of its gaslights. There's a moment most nights when you pause by your window, coat still on, too tired to undress. You look out over the street where the fog curls around the lamps and wonder how many lives you've failed to save today. You tell yourself that some survived because of you. That must be true. But you also know that medicine in this time is more art than science, and the canvas is rarely forgiving. You hear a knock again. A child's voice this time, calling through the door. You open it to find a boy, no older than 10, holding his cap in both hands. His mother's ill, he says. You follow him without question through twisting alleys and dripping eaves until you find yourself in another dim room where the air feels heavy with something unspoken. You kneel, check her pulse, and see at once that she's slipping away. There's no cure for what she has. You sit with her anyway, holding her hand until her breathing slows. It's a small kindness, but it's the only one that matters. Walking home again, you notice the church bells striking midnight. The city has grown quiet. Somewhere, a rat skitters across the street, its claws clicking softly against the stones. You think about how strange it is that this, the dirt, the disease, the constant nearness of death, has become normal, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. You realize that what keeps you going isn't hope exactly, but momentum. To stop would be to think, and to think would be unbearable. And yet, amid the fatigue, there are moments that still catch you off guard. The first breath of a newborn you've helped deliver, the faint smile of a patient recovering from fever, the way the morning light cuts through the fog, gold and soft, as if forgiving the city for everything it's done. You find yourself standing in that light sometimes, eyes closed, just listening. The hum of distant carriages, the shuffle of boots, the faint cry of a gull drifting inland from the river, the rhythm of their lives and yours, all tangled together in one endless pulse. You tell yourself you'll rest tomorrow. You won't, but the thought is pleasant enough to carry you through another night. You wake before sunrise again. Though you can't recall falling asleep, the city seems to have carried on without you, as if it barely noticed your absence. The fire in the grate has gone out, leaving behind the faint smell of coal and ash. The frost has crept along the inside of the window panes in delicate lacework patterns. You watch your breath cloud the glass and think that perhaps your own lungs are not much cleaner than the air outside. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a heel of bread and a sip of cold tea. You eat standing, coat half-buttoned, listening to the street stir to life. Somewhere, a costermonger shouts about apples. Somewhere else, a woman sings a half-remembered hymn while scrubbing steps. The city hums like a giant machine, each person one cog grinding against the next. You take your worn black bag from the table, its leather cracked, its handles polished smooth from years of use, and step out into the morning mist. The cold hits immediately. It's the kind that seeps into the bones and stays there. The cobblestones shine with last night's rain, and your breath joins the smoke rising from the chimneys in slow, ghostly trails. Every doorway hides someone coughing. Every alley smells faintly of something decaying. It's remarkable how quickly the human nose learns to forgive. You visit an elderly seamstress first. Her hands tremble too much to thread a needle, but she keeps trying. She tells you she can't afford to stop working. Her rent is due, and her landlord is not a patient man. You listen, check her pulse, and write a prescription for rest, a treatment she cannot afford. You know she won't follow it, and she knows you know. But there's comfort in the ritual. The diagnosis, the instruction, the small talk about the weather, the illusion of control in a world that rarely offers any. Your next patient is a coal porter who's developed a hacking cough that rattles the windows. He insists it's just the dust from the cellars. You nod, though you hear the telltale crackle of fluid in his chest. Tuberculosis, most likely. The word alone feels heavy, too final to speak aloud. You give him a small bottle of syrup and a warning to rest. He laughs, which turns into another fit of coughing. Rest, he wheezes. Not till I'm dead, doctor. He might be right. By midday, your hands are trembling slightly from exhaustion. You steady them by holding a cup of weak tea in both palms. Across from you in the small tea shop sits another physician, younger, neatly dressed, still with that shine of optimism you once carried. He talks about the new instruments arriving from Germany, microscopes so powerful they can almost see the invisible agents of disease. You listen politely, though you've learned not to trust miracles until they've survived a winter in London. He mentions a word you've been hearing more often lately: germs. Invisible things, living things, too small for the eye, yet powerful enough to kill. You imagine them floating in the air around you, riding the breath of every passerby, clinging to your gloves, your sleeves, your instruments. It's both fascinating and horrifying. This idea that the enemy might be smaller than dust. You wonder how many you've carried home without knowing. When you leave the tea shop, the sky has turned the color of pewter. The light fades early in winter, and the gas lamps bloom one by one, halos glowing in the mist. Somewhere, church bells strike 3, though it feels much later. You walk along the river for a while, trying to clear your thoughts. The Thames breathes slowly beside you, gray water flecked with bits of refuse, dead fish, and occasionally something worse. Yet even in its filth, there's a kind of calm. The tide moves regardless of human misery. It accepts everything without judgment. A small crowd gathers ahead, near the embankment steps. You push through gently and see a constable standing over a man who's collapsed, perhaps drunk, perhaps not. You kneel beside him, touch his neck, and feel nothing. The constable grunts, "Gone, is he?" You nod. The body is taken away without ceremony, swallowed into the machinery of the city. You stand there for a moment, watching the river's surface ripple where the body had lain. Then you walk on. Sometimes, when the day grows too heavy, you find yourself imagining what it must be like to live a life untouched by sickness. A life of letters, perhaps, or music, or quiet fields. But those thoughts feel distant, almost indulgent. You return to your surgery at dusk, light the lamps, and prepare for the evening's calls. The smell of carbolic soap burns faintly in your nose, sharp but reassuring. You sharpen your scalpel with the slow rhythm of habit. There's a knock. A man in a worn overcoat stands in the doorway, hat in hand. His wife has been laboring since morning, he says, and she's growing weak. You follow him through the fog, your lantern cutting a small circle of light through the dark. Inside the cramped room, the air is thick with heat and fear. You wash your hands in cold water, roll up your sleeves, and do what must be done. Hours later, when the child finally arrives, small, quiet but breathing, the relief in the room feels almost sacred. The mother cries softly. The father presses your hand with gratitude he can't put into words. You pack your instruments and step outside, where the cold night feels like a baptism. For a moment, the fog clears enough to reveal a sliver of moonlight glinting on the wet cobblestones. You take a deep breath, the air sharp and clean for once, and feel the ache in your shoulders ease slightly. There are nights when the work feels less like punishment and more like a strange kind of grace. Saving one life, easing one pain, it's enough to make the rest bearable. But those moments pass quickly. By the time you return home, the lamp oil is nearly gone. You write notes in your ledger by candlelight, the shadows on the wall swaying gently with every flicker of flame. The words blur together. Fever, cough, decline, deceased. You blow out the candle and sit in the dark, listening to the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the distant city, the faint rush of the river beyond. You think of how fragile it all is. The line between health and sickness, life and loss. You think of your own hands, the same hands that heal, that comfort, that sometimes fail. You flex them in the dark, feeling the stiffness in the joints, the faint sting of a cut you didn't notice earlier. You wonder if the air itself is trying to kill you, or if you've simply grown used to carrying death in your pocket. Still, tomorrow will come. It always does. You'll rise, dress, and step once more into the fog. The rhythm of their lives and yours will continue, steady as a pulse. The morning arrives, though you wouldn't know it by the light. The city wakes under a sky the color of wet paper, and the first thing you notice is the sound, a low, restless murmur that never really stopped through the night. Carts rattle, bells ring somewhere far off, and the air trembles faintly with the clank of metal and the whistle of steam. You've begun to think of London itself as a living creature, lungs full of smoke, veins of cobblestone, a heart that beats in the rhythm of its people. And like any body, it's never entirely well. You pull on your coat, brush the ash from your sleeves, and check your bag. Bandages, tinctures, a stethoscope that has seen too many winters. You pause a moment before leaving, as if waiting for the day to give you permission to start. It doesn't, of course. It never does. You step outside anyway. The first call takes you to the edge of Whitechapel, where the streets narrow into crooked lanes that smell of damp brick and old smoke. Children scatter at your approach, not out of fear, but because they've learned that doctors often mean bad news. The house you're looking for leans slightly to one side, its door swollen from rain. Inside, the patient is a man who used to mend boots, though he hasn't stood in weeks. His wife hovers behind you, clutching a handkerchief. You examine him gently, though you can feel his body surrendering, the way a flame thins before it dies. You speak softly, because there's nothing left to do but speak softly. When you step outside again, the street feels unnaturally quiet. The fog has thickened until the world has become a painting of itself, outlines without detail. You take a deep breath, and it tastes of soot and salt from the river. You tell yourself to keep walking, to find the next door, the next pulse, the next chance to do something that might matter. The rhythm of your work becomes a kind of prayer, though you're not sure to whom. Later, at the hospital, the atmosphere is different, brighter, louder, more ambitious. The great teaching wards are crowded with students, all sharp eyes and ink-stained cuffs. They lean over beds where patients lie half-conscious beneath white sheets, their faces pale under the gaslight. The smell is a mixture of carbolic acid, iron, and human fear. You remember when you first came here as a student, eager to learn the mysteries of the body. Now you see only the repetition, the same fevers, the same wounds, the same desperate hope in every gaze. A senior surgeon strides past you, his coat flaring like a cape. He talks of innovation, of progress, of the future. You nod, though you can't help noticing the stains on his cuffs, faint but unmistakable. The patients on his table rarely survive long enough to see that future. Still, the students watch him as if he were a prophet. Perhaps that's what medicine demands: faith, even when the evidence disagrees. You spend the afternoon assisting with an amputation. The patient is calm, unnervingly so. The ether mask muffles his breath, and when it's over, you realize you've been holding your own. You wash your hands in cold water, the pink whirlpool circling the drain, and think of how each life leaves its trace, faint but indelible. Outside, the light has shifted again, late afternoon, though the sky is dim enough to pass for dusk. You walk slowly toward home, past rows of tall houses where curtains twitch as you pass. Behind those curtains live people who call for you, only when all else fails, when the tonics, the teas, and the whispered prayers have done nothing. You wonder how many more doors you'll have to knock on before the day ends. A woman calls to you from a doorway. Her husband's fallen ill. She says you follow her inside, and the smell of gin hits first, sharp and sweet. The man on the floor is barely conscious, his face flushed, his breath shallow. You work in silence, checking his pulse, lifting his head, doing what little you can, When you leave, she thanks you with tears and a shilling wrapped in paper. You slip it into your pocket and walk on too tired to feel anything but the weight of it. There are nights when you almost envy the quiet simplicity of other trades. The carpenter, the baker, even the lamplighter. Each knows when the day begins and ends. For you, the hours blur until time itself feels like another illness you can't quite diagnose. Still, there's a peculiar peace in that blur. It dulls the edges of thought, smooths the sharp corners of memory. By the time you return to your room, your hands ache from the cold. You pour a little brandy into a cup and sit by the window, watching the fog drift past like a living thing. Somewhere below, a street musician plays a violin, slow, mournful notes that seem to hang in the air long after they fade. You close your eyes and let the sound fill the space where words would normally live. You think about the day's patients, the child, the seamstress, the coal porter, the man on the floor. You realize you remember their faces more clearly than your own. Each one leaves a small imprint, like fingerprints on glass. You don't know if that's compassion or just the accumulation of years. Perhaps they're the same thing. A soft rain begins. Tapping gently against the window, you find yourself listening to it as if it might speak. The city below quiets. Under the sound, the carriages slowing, the voices dimming. For a brief moment, everything feels still. You realize that this stillness, fragile, borrowed, fleeting, is the closest thing to peace you'll ever have. You blow out the lamp, settle back in your chair, and let the darkness take the shape of a familiar companion. Somewhere in that darkness, the faint rhythm of your heartbeat keeps time with the city's own. The rhythm of their lives and yours intertwined, tired, constant, and quietly enduring. And as your eyes begin to close, you remember why you keep going. Not for glory, or gratitude, or even hope, but because the work must be done. And someone must do it, and that, somehow, is enough. Imagine a time when the boundaries of science were still made of guesswork. You are standing in a Victorian laboratory, though it hardly deserves that grand title. The floorboards creak beneath your boots. The walls are lined with shelves sagging under jars, some filled with cloudy liquids, others with things you'd rather not identify. A faint smell of sulfur hangs in the air, mixed with the sweetness of alcohol and decay. Somewhere nearby, something drips. You are not alone. Across the table, a man in spectacles carefully pours a dark fluid from one beaker to another. His hand trembles slightly, but not from fear, from concentration. He mutters to himself in Latin, as though the language itself might keep the experiment from collapsing. The flame beneath his glass tube flickers blue, the color of invention and danger. This is medicine in the Victorian age, a world balanced between miracle and mistake. The instruments of discovery look suspiciously like the instruments of death, saws, scalpels, clamps, all gleaming with equal menace. Yet for the first time in human history, the great unknowable interior of the body is being explored not by guess, but by observation. And yet, the old beliefs have not vanished. They linger in the corners like shadows. Housewives still keep charms against the evil eye. Midwives whisper prayers over feverish children. And in the poorer districts, a man with steady hands and a steady bottle of gin can still pass for a doctor. You might think of this period as an awakening, and in many ways it was, but every awakening begins in darkness. In London's teaching hospitals, students jostle for a glimpse of dissection tables where cadavers lie under white sheets. The smell is overpowering, formaldehyde mingled with the faint sweetness of corruption. For some, it's unbearable. For others, intoxicating. The mysteries of life are being laid bare one sinew at a time. The human body, once a vessel of divine mystery, has become a puzzle to be solved. They cut, they sketch, They name each artery and nerve. They talk of function, of system, of balance. The language of the soul is slowly replaced by the language of science. And yet, for all their learning, death remains the most persuasive teacher. In a small ward nearby, a patient coughs blood into a handkerchief. Another moans softly in delirium. The doctors pace, charting temperatures, counting pulses, prescribing tonics whose ingredients sound more like alchemy than medicine: laudanum, mercury, arsenic, belladonna. The irony is never lost on them that in trying to heal, they sometimes hasten the end. But that's the bargain of discovery. To learn, one must risk harm. Every so often, a breakthrough flickers in the gloom, the stethoscope, for instance. A simple wooden tube, dismissed at first as a novelty. Yet once pressed against a chest, it reveals a world of sound, the slow percussion of the heart, the whisper of breath, the faint murmurs that betray disease before it blooms. For the first time, doctors can listen instead of guess. The instrument becomes both ear and empathy. Elsewhere, microscopes are revealing smaller worlds still. Through the glass, tiny creatures dance, too small to name, too numerous to count. To the Victorian mind, this is nothing short of sorcery. The unseen is becoming seen, the invisible suddenly accountable. But not everyone welcomes this revelation. For centuries, sickness was moral, not microbial. To say that illness comes from a creature smaller than dust was to unsettle the very foundation of belief. And yet, curiosity proves stronger than doctrine. In smoky laboratories and dim workshops, physicians turned scientists begin to trade whispers about new ideas, about contagion and hygiene and invisible life. They debate feverishly in journals and drawing rooms. Some argue that filth is the enemy, others that filth merely hides it. The lines between right and wrong blur as easily as ink on damp paper. Meanwhile, the ordinary people of the city continue to live much as they always have. They throw waste into the gutters, they draw water from the same river that swallows it, they breathe air thick with soot. To them, doctors are both saviors and charlatans, men who smell of strange chemicals and ask too many questions. But the questions are spreading faster than the answers. There is a quiet revolution happening, not in Parliament or in the streets, but in the way the human mind approaches mystery. The old pattern of thinking, where illness was divine punishment or imbalance of humors, begins to crumble. In its place grows something more daring and perhaps more frightening, the idea that every mystery has an explanation, and that the explanation can be found. Still, there's something wistful about this shift. The age of wonder is ending, replaced by the age of evidence. A fever is no longer a curse, it's a symptom. A miracle is no longer divine, it's chemical. For some, this feels like progress, for others, like loss. Take, for example, the strange practice of bloodletting. For centuries, doctors believed that to drain illness, one must drain blood. It was a ritual older than reason, elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its effect. In the early Victorian years, leeches were still bred in tanks by the thousands, shipped in crates across the channel. They became a kind of currency in medicine. Small, living instruments of misplaced hope. But then, slowly the data began to turn. Patients who were not bled often fared better than those who were. The evidence whispered what superstition would not. Sometimes, doing nothing is the truest act of healing. The great irony of progress is that it always looks absurd before it looks obvious. Some doctors clung to the old ways, unwilling to abandon what had once seemed sacred. They wore their traditions like armor, not realizing how heavy it had become. Others, mostly younger, embraced experimentation with near religious fervor. They filled their notebooks with observations, their shelves with bottles, their minds with the intoxicating sense that the world might finally be knowable. In truth, both were right and both were wrong. Science was advancing, yes, but it still stumbled through darkness, guided by flashes of intuition and accident. A misstep here, a lucky guess there. Every discovery born of error, every cure balanced on the edge of risk. You can almost hear it, the steady hum of that age. The scratching of pens on paper, the clink of glass, the soft sigh of a gas lamp turning low. In those sounds lives the heartbeat of curiosity itself, uncertain, flawed, but endlessly persistent. Evening settles over the city, and the laboratories grow quiet. A young doctor closes his notebook, blows out the lamp, and sits for a moment in the dark. He's been staring through his microscope for hours, his eyes aching, his mind buzzing. He's not sure what he's found, or whether it matters. But as he listens to the faint tick of the clock, he feels something shift, a small, patient certainty that the mysteries of the body are not infinite after all. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city coughs and mutters, its alleys alive with the same old miseries. But here, in this tiny room lit by a single flickering flame, something profound is happening. Ignorance is being outgrown. The flame sputters, then steadies again. Progress rarely burns bright. It glows, slow and stubborn against the dark. You could almost say the Victorians were addicted to mystery. Even as science began to unravel one thread after another, people clung to the comfort of the unexplained. There was a kind of poetry in not knowing, in believing that healing could come from a mineral spring, a magnet, a well-timed seance. Doctors tried to draw a line between what was real and what was imagined, but the line itself kept moving. There were so many kinds of healers in those days: herbalists, mesmerists, electrotherapists, each promising balance and vitality through some invisible force. Patients flocked to them, not because they were foolish, but because they were desperate. In an age where medicine still hurt more often than it helped, belief was often the gentler cure. In small rooms across London, you could find demonstrations of animal magnetism, a man in a velvet coat waving his hands over a patient's head, claiming to channel invisible energy through the ether. The audience would sit in rapt silence as the patient's eyelids fluttered. The pulse slowed, the body fell limp. Whether it was hypnosis, suggestion, or pure theater hardly mattered. For a moment, suffering obeyed command. Elsewhere, in polished parlors, genteel ladies gathered for séance, where doctors and mediums sometimes shared the same audience. Both professions dealt in unseen forces, both claimed to reach beyond the visible. The line between science and spiritualism blurred in candlelight. And then there were the quacks, the self-styled miracle workers who sold bottled hope by the ounce. They advertised in newspapers and on posters pasted to lampposts. Dr. Solomon's cordial balm of Gilead, Professor Holloway's pills and ointments, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a sweet mixture of morphine and treacle given freely to teething infants. These were not back-alley snake oil merchants. They were celebrities, touring the empire with trumpets and testimonials. A true doctor might scoff, but secretly envy the success. For while they struggled with poverty and infection, the quacks made fortunes on comfort. It is difficult, after all, to compete with certainty. And yet, even here, science began to infiltrate. The first chemical laboratories started analyzing these so-called remedies, uncovering what truly lay within. Mercury, opium, alcohol, the foundations of Victorian calm. It was revelation by disillusionment, the kind progress so often demands. In the quieter corners of the profession, something more profound was taking shape. A Scottish physician named Edward Jenner had shown decades earlier that cowpox could protect against smallpox. His method, at first dismissed as rural superstition, became the seed of vaccination. By the mid-Victorian era, the idea had grown that the body itself could learn to defend, to remember, to survive. But it was still a brutal process. Needles unsterilized, doses uncertain, children vaccinated by the thousands under open skies. Some lived, some didn't. Progress always exacted a toll, and those who questioned it were branded cowards. Yet each small success left a deeper mark, another glimpse of order in what once seemed chaos. The microscope grew more powerful. Germs gained names: Bacillus, Streptococcus, Vibrio. Diseases that had seemed like curses became cataloged, charted, almost tamed. There was wonder in it, yes, but also unease. The world had grown smaller, its mysteries reduced to dots on glass. And still, even the most modern physicians could not quite let go of intuition. They spoke of miasma and constitution, of moral weakness breeding physical disease. They believed that sin itself might fester like infection, that poverty was contagious in ways science could not yet explain. The Victorian doctor was caught between microscope and morality, between the pulpit and the laboratory bench. If you had walked the streets of London then, you might have seen both worlds at once. A lecture on germ theory held beside a shop selling bottled elixirs. An advertisement for ether anesthesia pasted above a poster for faith healing. It was an age that wanted to believe in everything: God, ghosts, and galvanism alike. The tension between faith and fact gave Victorian medicine its strange beauty. It was messy, contradictory, half alive with superstition, but pulsing with discovery. Each mistake pointed the way to something true. Each failure made the next cure possible. Imagine a young nurse leaving the hospital after midnight, her apron still damp from carbolic spray. She passes a fortune-teller's stall, the candle burning low, the woman inside offering to read her palm. The nurse hesitates, then smiles and keeps walking. She no longer believes that fate is written in lines. She's seen it written in the body instead, in the pulse, the temperature, the breath. It is in moments like this that an era shifts, not with fanfare, but with a single quiet choice. The nurse disappears into the fog, the lamp gutters out, and the world tilts a little closer to modern. And yet, there is still wonder left. Even the most rational minds cannot help but marvel at what they see beneath the lens, those tiny worlds moving in invisible harmony, proof that life is more intricate than imagination. Science had not killed mystery. It had simply relocated it. The Victorian doctor, standing by his instruments, might have felt that too, the awe of discovery, the humility of ignorance. Each vial, each slide, each patient, a reminder that knowledge, like healing, is never complete. The lamp burns low again. The pages of the laboratory journal flutter in the draft. Outside, the city exhales. You can almost smell both futures at once, the old world of incense and prayer, and the new world of antiseptic and glass. For a moment, they coexist. Then the light shifts, and the modern world quietly begins. By the later decades of the century, the work of medicine had begun to divide itself into two distinct languages, the scientific and the social. In the lecture halls, men argued over microbes and molecules. In drawing rooms, people whispered about nerves and morals. Both conversations circled the same question: what exactly makes a person well? Among the educated classes, nervous disorders became the fashionable illness of the day. Gentlemen complained of neurasthenia, a weakness of the nerves brought on by study, commerce, or the unrelenting pace of modern life. Ladies, meanwhile, suffered from hysteria, a diagnosis so elastic it could mean anything from sadness to boredom. Doctors prescribed long rest, seaside air, or the controversial rest cure, isolation, milk, and the complete removal of mental stimulation. It is easy now to smile at the absurdity of it. Yet those who lived then truly suffered. The very progress that cured fevers and infections had left the mind itself unguarded. The Victorians had learned to sterilize their instruments, but not their anxieties. Beneath the gentility, another revolution was taking place. Psychology was stirring quietly beneath the surface of medicine. Physicians began to suspect that the mind could wound the body as surely as any knife. A patient might recover from surgery, yet remain unwell. A soldier might return from war, but tremble at sudden sounds. The word trauma was still new, but its reality was ancient. A doctor named John Hewlings Jackson spoke of the brain as a layered instrument, each part capable of seizing control when the higher functions faltered. Others began to study memory, dreams, and madness. Their work was dismissed by many as philosophy in disguise, but in truth, the era of antisepsis had simply prepared the way for a subtler kind of cleanliness, an attempt to disinfect thought itself. Meanwhile, laboratories expanded like cathedrals. The hiss of burners replaced the toll of bells. Bottles labeled in Latin filled the shelves, their contents glowing faintly amber under gaslight. The great discovery of anesthesia, ether and chloroform, had turned the surgeon's theater from a scene of horror into one of eerie silence. It was now possible to cut without screaming, to explore the body as though it were a map. But the silence came at a cost. Patients no longer bore witness to their own survival. Pain, once a constant companion, became something to be banished, then forgotten. Some physicians worried that a patient who did not feel might not truly heal. Others argued that mercy was reason enough. In the wards, the differences between the old world and the new grew visible in small, almost poetic ways. The bandages were cleaner, the windows larger to let in light and air. Nurses, many trained in the style of Florence Nightingale, moved quietly between beds, recording temperatures with a precision that bordered on reverence. The smell of rot had faded, replaced by that sharp, almost holy tang of disinfectant. And yet, for all this order, something human persisted. When night fell, the wards filled again with whispers, prayers, confessions, the rustle of sheets. Medicine could explain much, but it could not comfort. A doctor could stitch flesh, drain fever, even restart a faltering heart, but the ache of loneliness still defied his instruments. Outside the hospitals, the public fascination with science turned almost devotional. Newspapers printed engravings of bacteria magnified to monstrous scale. Popular lecturers toured the country with lantern slides of human anatomy. In parlors and pubs alike, people spoke of discoveries the way they once spoke of scripture. Knowledge itself had become entertainment. Still, in the quiet of laboratories, the true work remained humble and slow. A researcher might spend 10 years watching mold grow on bread before realizing its power to kill infection. Another might notice that a weakened virus could protect against a stronger one. Chance guided as much as logic did. The great irony of the Victorian age is that its scientists believed they were dismantling mystery when in truth they were only refining it. For every question answered, two more appeared. To understand the body was to discover how fragile it really was, how a single cell could betray the whole. By the 1890s, the first glimpses of the modern world had begun to appear. Laboratories hummed with electricity. The new X-rays revealed skeletons as though the body had become glass. For the first time, people could see themselves from the inside, bones shining ghost-like against blackness. It was astonishing and terrifying in equal measure. Newspapers called it sorcery. Priests called it blasphemy. Doctors, ever pragmatic, called it useful. But in their quieter moments, even they felt the chill of awe. To expose the hidden structure of life was to stand at the edge of something sacred. If you had been there in one of those dark rooms, watching the glowing outline of a hand appear on a photographic plate, you might have understood how the Victorians never truly abandoned wonder. They only changed its vocabulary. Science had not ended belief. It had merely relocated it from heaven to the microscope, from prayer to process. And perhaps that was the real birth of modern medicine. Not the triumph of reason over faith, but their uneasy coexistence, a pact between curiosity and humility. The century drew to a close, with hospitals brighter, cleaner, and more crowded than ever. Death was no longer the default. It had become an opponent, sometimes even a stranger. Yet the doctors of that time, despite all their instruments and equations, still carried something of their ancestors. A quiet acceptance that no matter how deep one looks into the flesh, the final mystery remains untouched. The lamps burn lower, the laboratories fall silent. The smell of disinfectant lingers in the air, sharp and faintly floral. You can almost hear the ticking of the century itself, counting down toward the modern age. For the Victorians, it was enough to believe that the world, if not entirely cured, was at least being understood. And perhaps that was its own kind of healing, the slow alignment of curiosity with care, of knowledge with kindness. Imagine yourself walking up the steps of a Mayfair townhouse on a crisp London morning. The brass knocker gleams, the door opens soundlessly, and a butler leads you inside. The air smells faintly of polished wood and perfume. On the wall hangs a portrait of some noble ancestor who looks as though he disapproves of everyone. You are ushered into a drawing room where a physician is already waiting. He's impeccably dressed, black coat, white gloves, silver-topped cane, the very image of discretion. His stethoscope rests in his breast pocket like a piece of jewelry. He smiles in that professional way that conveys sympathy without intimacy. This is medicine for the elite, quiet, dignified, and vastly more profitable. The patient before him is a lady of about 30, pale and exquisitely tired. She speaks of sleeplessness, of nerves, of a faint tremor that appears whenever her husband mentions travel. The doctor listens gravely, though he's already diagnosing her before she finishes the sentence. Hysteria, or something close to it. The fashionable illness of the fashionable woman. He prescribes rest, solitude, and perhaps a brief stay at a seaside resort. The treatment will include gentle walks, light reading, and no conversation of a stimulating kind. He says all this softly, as though describing a religious retreat. The lady nods, relieved. Her husband thanks the doctor with a crisp note slipped discreetly into his hand. The physician bows, promises a follow-up visit, and is gone before the ink on the prescription has dried. That, in essence, was the rhythm of high society medicine, a careful dance between sincerity and theater. These doctors were part healer, part confidant, part moral advisor. They treated ailments of the body, certainly, but also of decorum. A lady too cheerful risked vulgarity. A lady too sad risked madness. The cure, naturally, was moderation in emotion, as in appetite. There were dozens of such physicians in London alone, each with their own small empire of patients, gossip, and reputation. They dined at the same tables as their clients, exchanged polite letters, and occasionally fell into discreet scandal. Some genuinely believed in their craft. Others simply understood that a calm tone and impeccable handwriting could soothe more effectively than any tonic. The irony, of course, was that the poor had sickness without care, and the rich had care without sickness. Evening gatherings often turned into informal consultations. A hostess would complain of headaches, a young man of melancholy. Someone would mention the dreadful pace of modern life. The doctor, balancing a sherry glass, would murmur something about nerves and rest, and the conversation would flow on. Medicine had become not a science, but a language, a way to make discomfort sound elegant. It wasn't all pretense, though. The late Victorians genuinely believed that civilization itself came with its own set of ailments. Too much thought, too little sun, too many novels, too few duties. Physicians began to diagnose society as though it were a single restless patient. They wrote of the epidemic of fatigue, the crisis of overwork, the decline of masculine vigor, even boredom acquired a medical name. Meanwhile, the remedies grew stranger. Some doctors prescribed electric belts that promised to recharge the nervous system. Others offered inhalations of ozone, champagne tonics, or therapeutic horse rides. There were clinics devoted entirely to hydropathy, the healing power of water, where patients were wrapped in cold sheets, doused in fountains, and sent home refreshed, if slightly bewildered. One fashionable physician, Dr. James Crichton Browne, claimed that London's ladies were suffering from intellectual exhaustion brought on by excessive reading. The cure, naturally, was less reading and more embroidery. Another, Dr. Playfair, pioneered the rest cure, a regime of confinement and milk that drove more than one patient quietly mad. Among them was a young American writer named Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who later turned her experience into a story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a quiet indictment of a medicine that mistook silencing for healing. There were gentler forms of care, too. Many doctors genuinely tried to bridge science and sympathy, sensing that illness was not merely a failure of tissue, but of spirit. They prescribed conversation, art, even laughter. A few brave souls advocated for women's mental health as something real rather than fashionable. They were the minority, but their compassion left marks that outlasted their titles. In these mirrored drawing rooms, one could see the entire paradox of Victorian progress. The city's poor were being dissected, vaccinated, sterilized. Its rich were being diagnosed, coddled, and prescribed leisure. One half of society was taught endurance, the other, fragility. The doctor stood between them, translator of suffering for both worlds. And yet, in his quieter moments, even the fashionable physician must have wondered which kind of patient he preferred. The working-class woman coughing in a tenement offered gratitude he could feel. The duchess in silk offered admiration he could spend. Both were patients, both expected miracles. In truth, medicine for the elite was less about the body and more about control of emotion, of behavior, of image. A good doctor didn't just heal, he maintained the illusion that order still reigned. That society, despite its speed and smoke and sleeplessness, could be kept tidy. Late in the evening, when the last carriage has rolled away, the doctor returns to his own rooms. He takes off his gloves, his coat, and sits by the fire with a glass of brandy. The house is quiet. The ticking of the clock is the only sound. Perhaps he thinks for a moment of the hospital wards he once worked in. The noise, the blood, the raw necessity of it all. The patients there never thanked him with letters on embossed stationery. They thanked him by breathing. He feels a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or nostalgia. Then he drains his glass, sets it down, and folds his hands. Tomorrow will bring new calls, new nerves, new polite illnesses to attend. The rhythm of civility is as relentless as any fever. And somewhere, not far from his townhouse, a different kind of doctor lights a lamp in a charity clinic. The two men will never meet, but their worlds depend on each other. One polished, one broken, both convinced they are keeping London alive. The irony would not have been lost on them. Among the upper classes, medicine gradually became less about survival and more about refinement, a delicate tuning of the nerves, an adjustment of temperament. Illness itself became a kind of fashion accessory, worn lightly and discussed with practiced melancholy. "My nerves," a woman might sigh. In the same tone, another might speak of a painting. "My digestion," a gentleman might complain, as though referring to a misbehaving servant. Doctors, ever adaptable, learned to diagnose according to taste. There were nervous complaints for scholars, indigestion for merchants, melancholy for poets. Every calling had its signature affliction. each one dignified enough to preserve respectability. You might imagine a physician arriving at a grand estate in the country, his carriage crunching over gravel, his bag polished to a mirror sheen. The patient awaits in a sunlit parlor, wrapped in a shawl of imported silk, surrounded by flowers and faint music from the next room. The air smells of wax and orange blossom. The doctor bows slightly, listens to her account, and nods in slow rhythm, as if conducting an invisible orchestra of ailments. She speaks of fainting spells, of palpitations, of an unshakable sadness that falls like fog. He assures her it is simply the strain of society, a touch of exhaustion brought on by the endless duties of comfort. He prescribes tonics, bitter with iron, sweet with syrup, and recommends sea air or mountain scenery. It is understood that she will not go alone. Illness, for a woman of means, is a social affair. The prescriptions themselves are less important than the performance of care. The doctor must sound authoritative but never cruel, compassionate but never familiar. His voice is part of the treatment, measured and warm, a kind of hypnosis for the anxious privileged. In truth, the maladies of the wealthy were not entirely imaginary. Their lives were often so confined by ritual that the body rebelled in the only ways it could: sleeplessness, trembling, nausea, a sudden inability to breathe. The modern vocabulary would call it anxiety or depression. The Victorians called it refinement. To suffer from nerves was to prove that one had them. Men of means, too, cultivated their own delicate afflictions. Exhaustion from intellectual overwork became an accepted badge of seriousness. Gentlemen were urged to avoid excitement, to eat plainly, to take the waters at Bath or the Alps. In a way, the diagnosis provided permission to retreat, to rest, to feel without shame. A nervous collapse could be more socially graceful than failure. There were stranger cures, too. Some doctors swore by electricity, small galvanic devices strapped to the wrists or worn beneath waistcoats, promising vigor through invisible current. Others offered hypodermic morphine for melancholy or cocaine lozenges for fatigue. The age that discovered the germ also discovered addiction. A few physicians grew notorious for their eccentric treatments. Dr. George Taylor prescribed horseback riding machines to restore women's circulation. Dr. Kellogg of Michigan promoted cereal as a moral safeguard against sin. Between the absurd and the inspired, medicine and marketing blurred again. Still, within this theater of well-intentioned nonsense, moments of sincerity persisted. A skilled doctor might sit quietly beside a patient, listen without judgment, and prescribe something truly radical: kindness, patience, the permission to feel. It was rare, but it happened. Reputation was the lifeblood of these physicians. A single failure could ruin them. A royal recommendation could make them immortal. London society whispered about its doctors the way it gossiped about its painters and poets. There were favorite diagnosticians for every ailment, each with a following as loyal as any congregation. Those who attended the aristocracy often found themselves entangled in matters far beyond medicine. They kept secrets of heirs, affairs, and inherited madness. They became confessors, witnesses, sometimes accomplices. The Hippocratic oath stretched thin under the weight of discretion. And yet, for all their wealth, their patients still feared the same things as the poor: pain, decay, the slow betrayal of the body. Money could purchase comfort, but not immunity. The difference lay in silence. Among the rich, suffering was not to be seen. The dying were hidden in upper floors, attended by nurses who spoke little. Mourning itself was choreographed: black crape, drawn curtains, measured grief. Sometimes the fashionable doctors found themselves invited to funerals of their own patients, praised for their devotion, even when they'd failed. They would stand quietly at the back, gloves in hand, wondering what else could have been done, though deep down they knew the answer was nothing. Death moved through all houses alike, rich and poor, indifferent to decorum. After such days, the doctor might return home and stare at the reflection in his polished instruments. He would see not the image of a savior, but of a man performing an impossible role, expected to soothe what could not be cured, to dignify what could not be prevented. In the solitude of his study, he might even admit to himself that medicine, for all its progress, was still a form of faith, not the old faith of prayer and penance, but a quieter creed that care, even when powerless, still mattered. The hour grows late. The lamps flicker low in the grand houses of the city. Somewhere, a carriage clatters down the street, bearing another doctor toward another consultation. Inside the parlors, the last conversation fades, and the patients drift toward uneasy sleep. In that hush, you can almost hear the heartbeat of the age, steady, elegant, and faintly fragile. A civilization learning to treat its fears with ritual and reason, and calling both medicine. There were nights when the same physician who treated duchesses and barristers found himself unable to sleep. He would sit at his writing desk, the gaslight turned low, and stare at his appointment book. It was full, yet strangely hollow. A parade of names and ailments that blurred together: nerves, fatigue, sleeplessness. It might have been a catalog of the age itself. He sometimes wondered if his patients truly wanted to be healed. Health, after all, left little to talk about. Illness gave purpose, a rhythm, a reason to be observed. A society built on leisure required something to occupy its hours. A small, manageable suffering, neither fatal nor fake, filled the space perfectly. But even he, with his cynical wisdom, could not deny that pain, no matter how genteel, was still pain. He had seen the fine tremor of a hand that refused to hold a teacup, the trembling of a lip that concealed exhaustion behind politeness. The privileged, too, were human. They simply suffered with better curtains drawn around them. The real difference lay not in biology, but in narrative. The poor were sick from circumstance. The rich were sick from meaning. Their ailments were stories told to explain the unease of living too comfortably in a world that still smelled faintly of coal and mortality. He thought sometimes of the surgeons he had known at the beginning of his career, men who stood for hours in blood and heat, sawing through bone with unwashed hands. Those doctors worked at the edge of death every day. He, by contrast, worked at the edge of boredom. One demanded courage, the other endurance. Yet both kinds of medicine shared one quiet truth. The act of listening mattered as much as the cure. Occasionally, amid the perfumed drawing rooms and the embroidered pillows, a patient would speak honestly. She would confess that her faintness began after a child's death, or that her sleeplessness hid a husband's cruelty. The doctor, trained to be discreet, would nod and write something neutral in his notes. Nervous exhaustion, perhaps, but the words stayed with him long after he left. He understood, though he could not say so aloud, that heartbreak had symptoms too. It was these moments that tethered him to his profession, the small, unspoken recognitions, the shared silence when no prescription would suffice. Sometimes he caught himself envying the new generation of doctors who spoke of hygiene and germs, of clean air and clean water. Their work had rules, measurements, results. His relied on conversation, on observation, on the fragile bridge between two minds. You could disinfect a scalpel, but not despair. As the century wore on, the elegant world that sustained him began to falter. The motor car rattled through the streets, the telephone rang in the halls of the rich, and science, impatient, tireless, marched forward. The doctor's calling cards, once delivered by footman, now seemed old-fashioned. Even illness changed its style. Tuberculosis became poetic, neurasthenia passé. The new afflictions belonged to factories and telegraphs. In his later years, the doctor worked less and wrote more. His journals, bound in leather and filled with neat copperplate, read like a chronicle of a vanishing species, both patient and practitioner. "The nervous complaint," he wrote once, "is merely the soul's protest against too little to do." Another entry, months later: "I sometimes think our cures are less medical than ceremonial. They preserve order in an uncertain world." He retired to the countryside, to a small cottage overlooking the downs. The air there was clear, the horizon uncluttered. He tended a modest garden, rising early to water the herbs that once filled his prescriptions. His hands, long trained for the delicate rituals of the city, grew rough again, as though remembering their purpose. Neighbors sometimes came for advice. A child's cough, a laborer's sprained wrist. He treated them simply, with clean water and patience. There was no need for diagnosis or delicacy. These were the kinds of illnesses that spoke plainly and expected the same in return. He found comfort in that honesty. On quiet evenings, he would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the light fade over the fields. He thought often about his years in London, the faces, the rooms, the voices that had filled his days. He no longer judged them. He understood now that every age has its sickness, and every sickness its dignity. The body merely follows where the spirit leads. Sometimes, in the fading light, he imagined his former patients, the lady who could not sleep, the young man who feared collapse, the countless others who mistook weariness for mystery. He hoped they had found peace, or at least distraction. He smiled faintly at the thought that perhaps without realizing it, they had healed long ago, not through tonics or travel, but simply by surviving. The evening wind moved through the garden, carrying the faint scent of lavender and soil. He took a slow breath, feeling the rhythm of his pulse, steady and unhurried. The old unease of the city seemed far away now, replaced by a stillness that no prescription could replicate. He had spent a lifetime measuring others' heartbeats. Now at last, he listened to his own. And if he dreamed that night, it was of a world both absurd and beautiful, one where medicine had become manners and compassion, even when misguided, had still managed to matter. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a century. The air has changed, the factories no longer seem miraculous, the smoke less romantic, the light of progress less blinding. In the hospitals, the floors shine with disinfectant, and the sharp smell of carbolic has become as familiar as morning coffee. What once seemed extraordinary has turned habitual, and the old fears, though quieter, still linger. You walk down a corridor where the walls are tiled white, the color of cleanliness and caution. A nurse passes with a basin. A patient coughs behind a curtain. Somewhere, an orderly hums a hymn under his breath. The world has learned the language of healing, but it still speaks it with an accent of sorrow. The doctors of this new age, the children of Lister, the grandchildren of guesswork, have inherited a kind of double vision. They see the body as a mechanism, predictable and precise, yet they still sense its mystery. Their journals are full of numbers, but their hearts remember stories. They no longer fear the invisible enemy. They fear forgetting that the enemy was ever invisible. In their hands, instruments gleam, sterile and efficient. They measure pulse and temperature with confidence that would have astonished their predecessors. And yet, sometimes, late at night, they still fall silent at a patient's bedside, unsure whether to speak or pray. It is the quiet that changes them. In the stillness of a ward at midnight, the hum of machinery sounds like breathing. The gas lights flicker. Somewhere, a clock ticks the rhythm of the living. In that small space between science and silence, medicine remembers what it is, not conquest, but compassion made methodical. You can trace the progress of an age through the way it treats its sick. The Victorians began with bloodletting and bravado. They ended with sterilized instruments and the first murmurs of anesthesia. Between those two extremes lies a story not of triumph, but of persistence, the refusal to look away from pain, even when powerless to stop it. And yet progress always asks a price. For every life saved, another was lost to experiment. For every discovery, someone had to be the lesson. The doctors carried those losses quietly, written not in textbooks but in the shadows beneath their eyes. Perhaps that is why the profession itself learned gentleness, because knowledge had come through so much suffering. Outside the hospitals, the world was healing too, in its own uneven way. The streets of London no longer reeked of sewage, clean water ran from taps, children survived infancy with increasing reliability. But the human condition, the ache of worry, the shadow of mortality, remained unchanged. The doctor could delay death, not erase it. There is something strangely comforting in that constancy. The same heartbeat that pulsed through a surgeon's hand in 1850 still beats in yours now. The same fragile miracle of breath, the same thin line between weakness and strength. The tools have changed, the body has not. Sometimes in the calm after an operation, when the patient sleeps and the instruments have been cleaned, a doctor might pause and feel the weight of that truth. The silence in the room feels almost sacred, the hush of life reasserting itself. In that moment, progress feels less like invention and more like gratitude. You can imagine the ghosts of those early physicians standing nearby, the exhausted man in his foggy surgery, the earnest Joseph Lister in his carbolic haze, the gentleman doctor writing neat prescriptions in ink that has long since faded. Each in their way gave something irreplaceable, the courage to look closely. They lived in an age that believed every mystery could be solved. We live in one that knows mysteries simply change shape. The unseen is still with us, though now it hides in molecules, in code in quiet corners of the mind. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Victorian doctor, that humility, not certainty, is the truest form of progress. To wash one's hands, to listen carefully, to act with care even when unsure. These remain the oldest and newest arts of healing. The rain begins again outside. The sound is soft against the glass, like a memory returning. You can almost see the city through time. The same rooftops, the same river, the same restless pulse beneath the surface. Somewhere a doctor walks home beneath an umbrella, tired but not defeated. His footsteps echo the rhythm that has guided them all, the rhythm of doing what must be done because someone must do it. And if you listen closely, through the hum of the present, you can still hear the faint heartbeat of that century. Slower now, steadier, wrapped in the calm of understanding. The world has learned to wash, to heal, to wait. It has learned that progress is not a shout, but a whisper carried forward by countless quiet hands. There is a kind of peace that comes only after exhaustion, the peace that follows centuries of struggle, discovery, and quiet endurance. Victorian medicine, for all its contradictions, was never really about conquering death. It was about learning to live alongside it, to make the fragile act of survival a little more merciful. You can picture, if you wish, a doctor at the turn of the century standing before a hospital window as dawn spreads its thin light over the rooftops. His sleeves are rolled up, his hands still red from washing. Behind him, the ward is quiet. Rows of white beds, the air faintly humming with disinfectant and sleep. Outside, carriages rattle, the world resuming its noise. Inside, for one suspended moment, everything feels still. He doesn't know the name of everyone he has saved, and he remembers too clearly the faces of those he couldn't. That balance, the strange arithmetic of compassion, is what defines his life. He doesn't believe he's a hero. He believes he's a witness, someone who has seen what pain does to people and what people do for one another in the face of pain. Sometimes, when he walks home through the quiet streets, he passes the statue of Joseph Lister in Portland Place. The bronze face looks serene, detached, almost indifferent, but the doctor feels something like kinship. Lister's ideas have become so ordinary now that few stop to think how costly they once were. The world moves on, and that perhaps is the highest honor to be forgotten because your work succeeded too well. He thinks too of the others, the ones whose names never made it to statues. The midwives and nurses, the apothecaries, the surgeons who bled and burned and stitched with unsteady hands before anyone knew better. They are the foundation of every clean ward and quiet recovery. Progress is never made by brilliance alone. It grows out of patience, out of small kindnesses, repeated until they change the shape of things. The same rhythm continues now, the pulse of care passing from hand to hand. Each generation believes itself modern, but the gestures are the same. The checking of a pulse, the listening, the soft reassurance. Technology refines the tools, but not the instinct. The human need to mend, to comfort, to try, that remains untouched. If you could fold time and walk once more through those gaslit streets, you might find that not much has changed. The fear in a patient's eyes, the quiet pride in a doctor's step, the way both find solace in each other's presence. The details differ, but the feeling endures. Medicine has always been an act of faith, not in gods, but in people. Faith that pain can be understood, that life is worth the effort, that compassion is its own cure. The Victorians, for all their mistakes, understood that better than most. They built hospitals not only of stone, but of belief, that light and air and order could save. That belief persists. Every hospital corridor, every clinic waiting room carries a trace of their hope, that humanity could civilize even its own suffering. The world outside those walls will always be untidy. Disease will adapt, death will not be banished, and medicine will continue its long dialogue with the unknown. But within the quiet rooms where one person helps another, there is a steadiness that outlasts every era. If you listen now very carefully, you might hear that steadiness, the soft footstep in a corridor, the low murmur of comfort, the small sigh of relief when pain eases, it is the same sound Victorian doctors once heard when they leaned close to their patients and realized that life-fragile, miraculous life had chosen for the moment to stay. Outside, the rain lightens. The morning grows pale and still. Somewhere, a new doctor ties her apron, checks her instruments, and steps into the day. She does not think of history, though it moves quietly beside her. She does not think of heroes, though she walks in their shadows. She simply begins, as they did, one patient, one heartbeat, one small act of care at a time. And so the rhythm continues. The rhythm of progress and pain, of humility and hope, the rhythm of their lives and ours, unbroken, unseen, enduring. And if you're still awake, thank you for listening.